Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with some sequels to Sibelius' Symphony Number 7, a talk that we just recently did, if this is still roughly the 21st century when you're watching this. And one of the things I mentioned there was that the Sibelius Seventh, which is a one-movement symphony, was a tremendously influential piece in music history, owing to the fact that it's a one-movement symphony. Now, it's not as if one-movement symphonies did not exist. There were various evolutions and anticipations of them that came earlier, and quite a few that came later. And in fact, there were several schools of what you might call one-movement symphonies, one of which is not Sibelius's, was the idea of a four-movement symphony with all the movements squeezed into one continuous span. That is, they're played without pause. But they have distinct movement identities, and the first of those was Schumann's Fourth, at least in its revised version, where Schumann said, play them all without a pause. And then after that, there were other iterations of that. Possibly the most famous was the Schoenberg Chamber Symphony, and later followed by Schrecker's Chamber Symphony and all those sort of late fin de siècle things that were called chamber symphony. These were one-movement symphonies which also incorporated more or less the standard four-movement form into a single overarching movement. And they were quite influential in their way and within their school, but not quite as much as Sibelius' Seventh, or in the same way as Sibelius' Seventh. Nielsen's Fourth is another symphony in which all of the movements are run on to each other. But Sibelius' Seventh was something else entirely, because Sibelius' Seventh was a one-movement work that is like no other one-movement work. It doesn't follow any pre-established formal model. It evolves its own formal model as it goes. And that was a new thing. In its way, it was a revolutionary thing, even though the musical language is quite tonal and even diatonic, very easy to listen to and pleasant and melodic and full of the normal emotions we expect a symphony to have: grandeur, passion, exaltation, tragedy, frighteningness. All of those things are in there. But, most of the time, those things are expressed within some sort of traditional view of what we call sonata form. And that means that there's an exposition and a development and a recapitulation. And Sibelius' Seventh actually sort of has that sort of kind of, but not in the traditional sense at all. I mean, you can't have a large musical structure that does not rely on some kind of repetition and development and repeat of what you've heard before to give the thing a shape. These are all normal things. But Sibelius had his own method of movement, which was completely independent from the sonata method of getting from one place to another by modulation through keys or whatever. Sibelius had a whole system that was based on ostinatos and pedal points and shifting tonal centers. We don't have to go into the technical details. You just have to know that because he had his own method for creating the impression of a symphonic movement, a struggle, a journey to a goal, he didn't have to use the formal apparatus that had been developed by Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven in writing his symphonies. And actually, the last major movement that employed what we might call a traditional sonata form in Sibelius was the first movement of the Fourth Symphony. And even that's starting to get away from, because it's a slow movement, and it has some interesting and distinctive features of its own. But after that, Sibelius's quest as a symphonist was to create a genuine expressive journey that we call the symphony, even though it's very loosely defined. I mean, these are not hardcore concepts that we're dealing with, but to create that kind of approach, a big, serious orchestral piece in abstract that isn't about, it's abstract. It's not about, like trees or the way, the weather, or, automobiles, things, not a tone poem. It doesn't tell a specific story, but evokes these emotions in a satisfying way. And that's in a way what symphonies do. And with Sibelius, the concept of the symphony really was changed and enlarged in his own very special way. He's often contrasted, for example, to Mahler, because Mahler was one of these all-inclusive, eclectic guys who expanded the concept of what the symphony could do by bringing other things in. Sibelius expanded the concept of what the symphony could do by leaving things out, you might want to call it, by creating these self-consistent, organic, somehow spontaneously generating musical structures. It's a very, very different idea, but they're both equally valid and both were equally successful, and I think they're both equally marvelous. I really do. So in talking about these sequels to Sibelius Seventh, some of which are sequels, a couple of which are maybe even prequels, we're going to talk about these different symphonic traditions and play a few examples for you to have some fun with. And maybe you'll encounter some music you haven't heard before and some composers you may want to follow up with. Now, the first and most obvious question after Sibelius' Seventh Symphony is, what were other Finnish composers doing? You might think that they were all raring to pick up where Sibelius left off, but that wasn't quite true because Sibelius' reputation in Finland was similar to what Beethoven's was in Germany. People were a little bit, I think, unwilling to take on the challenge that Sibelius represented. And when they did not want to start with his last, and some would think in some ways most characteristic and revolutionary work. You go back a little bit and you start a little earlier. It happened with Beethoven too. The big model that most other composers took as their exemplar of Beethoven's work was the third piano concerto when they were writing concertos in any case, not symphonies. For example, Brahms' first refers back to Beethoven's third piano concerto in many ways. They didn't want to use Beethoven's latest work, the late Beethoven string quartets, Beethoven's last symphony, the one I'm not going to tell you what it is because I don't have my tie. I'm going to keep clipping in with me wearing a tie. That one, the one with the choral finale. Not everybody was so quick to take on the challenge of late Beethoven because it was considered to be either eccentric or just too extraordinary to mess with. And I think late Sibelius is a little bit like that too. But there is a composer who did write a one-movement symphony, which is absolutely fabulous, and that you really want to hear. It is Einar Englund. Now, Einar Englund was a tremendously fine symphonist. He wrote 7 symphonies, and they've all been recorded. You can get them on Ondine. It's a wonderful, wonderful series. I really, really enjoy his work and had a little bit of a personal contact with it. I've mentioned this before because I reviewed his first 2 symphonies, decades ago for Fanfare while he was, I think he was still alive then. Yeah, he died in 1999. Yeah. So he was still around when that review came out and it apparently made a very big difference, at least to him. I'm very happy that it did. And that he, started to get some international recognition because he deserves it. His early style was somewhat similar to Shostakovich and that crew. And one of his symphonies is a choral symphony. It's just really wonderful, wonderful music. And his 5th, which is subtitled the Fennica, which is Finnish, is a one-movement symphony, rather not too obviously like the Sibelius Seventh, but certainly in the footsteps, following in the footsteps of the Sibelius Seventh. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful piece. I'm going to play you a little bit of it because this is a fabulous performance. It has actually his 4th symphony. Well, here it is. His 4th symphony, which is for strings and percussion, called the Nostalgic. And it has this incredible second movement called Tempus Fugit. Time flies with all kinds of weird percussion sounds and clock noises. It's just great. And then a suite of incidental music called The Great Wall of China, which has a homage to Shostakovich in here, which is just a riot. March a la Shostakovich, which is a takeoff on the finale of Shostakovich's 9th Symphony. Englund is a composer you really should know. He also wrote a couple of smashing piano concertos, a terrific violin concerto, Very, very enjoyable. And here is the opening of his Symphony Number 5, the Fennica. And it's only, by the way, like Sibelius Seventh, about 18 minutes long. 19 minutes long, 18, 19 minutes long. It's just a perfect little symphonic masterpiece. Wonderful. Here you go. That was the Tampere Philharmonic under Eri Klas in the Symphony Number 5 of Einar Englund, one of the one-movement symphonies that is definitely a sequel to Sibelius' Symphony Number 7. And if you like the Sibelius, chances are you'll get the Englund. The style is not quite the same. The sound isn't anything the same. Nothing sounds like Sibelius, and Englund sounds like Englund. But the conception, the idea is similar. Next, what have we got? Oh, these are a couple. Oh, these are fun to talk about. So here are some other one-movement symphonies, one of which we also, I think I played a sample of a little while back, and it's quite splendid. It's Carl Amadeus Hartmann, his Symphony Number 2, which is subtitled Adagio. It's actually a slow, fast, slow symphony, very, very similar in its shape to what Sibelius does in his Seventh. It's rather cool in that respect. I have no idea if Hartmann was even aware of Sibelius when he wrote his Second Symphony, but it's without question a single movement, another masterpiece, fabulous, fabulous work that everybody who cares about these things should really get to know. Carl Amadeus Hartmann was a great composer, wonderful composer. It's very interesting, the only post-war German symphonist worthy of the term. Really, there were no others, or at least I haven't heard them yet. I mean, who knows? They may exist out there somewhere. But he was, without question, a major artist who made a major statement, and all of his symphonies took shape, or most of them. I mean, there were some earlier pre-war works, but he essentially reinvented himself after World War II. He sat out the war in internal exile, and after the war, produced 8 symphonies. Roughly after the war, about 8 symphonies, and they are wonderful, wonderful works of modern symphonic architecture. And the second is one of the very best in a single movement. So Hartmann is somebody to think about. Another person that was worth mentioning, I think, and it's kind of important that we don't forget about him, is Shostakovich. Now, nobody likes his second and third symphonies, because they're pretty awful in a lot of respects. I mean, they were experiments. They're modernist, futuristic experiments. Both have choral finales based on absolutely atrocious socialist, realist, revolutionary texts. The second has a factory whistle in it, and the third it's a factory whistle in F sharp, I think, to be specific. The third is a real takeoff on the choral finale of you-know-who's Last Symphony. It's really, they're never going to be popular, but they are one-movement symphonies. And it's interesting to just consider as a proof of how fascinatingly successful and unique the Sibelius Seventh was in its day, that writing one-movement symphonies of this type, the way Shostakovich did, was considered, the acme of symphonic futurism. It really was. I mean, Sibelius, it was just the natural outcome of where his music had been taking him. But for the rest of the world, a one-movement symphony was a big deal and quite the unusual thing. So I want to mention them in passing and just, let us not forget that in his more experimental phase, one of the experiments was a one-movement symphony. All right, now let's turn to some of the obvious influences of Sibelius's actual piece, aside from from Einar Englund, because, where Sibelius was always popular was in the United States and in the UK. And there are a lot of composers in the United States and the UK who were very, very heavily influenced by Sibelius's work. Vaughan Williams, for example, dedicated his fifth to Sibelius. Arnold Bax dedicated music to Sibelius. Walton's first could not exist without the example of Sibelius. None of them wrote one-movement symphonies, mind you, but the influence was there. And so it was only a matter of time. And in the United States, it was the same thing. Sibelius was passionately advocated for by Koussevitzky, for example, and by the people at Walter Damrosch, who commissioned Tapiola for the New York Philharmonic or the New York Symphony Society or whatever it was called back then. I mean, Sibelius had a following in the Anglo-Saxon world, and so it's not surprising that Samuel Barber's First Symphony is a one-movement symphony. It divides up into four parts, but those four parts are not exactly traditional four symphonic parts. In fact, it does go rather like Sibelius Seventh in the sense that it begins with a sort of slow, brooding introduction and returns to that at the end. And in fact, it begins in a minor key and ends in a minor key. It's quite unusual in that respect. I want to play you just a little bit of the opening, it's the opening of the last section, the final section, which is just wonderfully lyrical and heartfelt, and a wonderful example of, Barber's sort of neo-romantic lyricism, and just beautiful music. I mean, it's really, really beautiful music. This is Marin Alsop conducting the Royal Scottish National Orchestra on Naxos. Here's just a bit of the Barber first. Maybe you hear something of the opening adagio of the Sibelius Seventh in that music. It has that kind of I don't know how to describe it. It's a nostalgic and yearning lyricism to it. It's very, very beautiful. Of course, it doesn't sound as Sibelius-y as Sibelius does, and Barber sounds like Barber, but it's a beautiful work. Another American symphony, perhaps the iconic American symphony in the spirit of the Sibelius Seventh, is Roy Harris's Third. This is, the New York Philharmonic under Leonard Bernstein, his Sony recording, because he did it twice. The Harris Third was immediately considered a masterwork. It seems to have fallen by the wayside, which is a terrible pity because it really is a masterwork. And it begins a bit like the Sibelius in the sense that there's this long sort of string exordium. In the case of the Harris, it's sort of this long string threnody. It's darker than the Sibelius. And then there's a pastoral interlude. And then in this case, there's a fugue. Now, Sibelius never wrote formal counterpoint in his symphonies. The only fugue in Sibelius's symphonies is actually a tiny little fugato in the scherzo of his First Symphony. I think after that, I don't think there was much fugue stuff in Sibelius. Well, maybe the scherzo of the Second Symphony too has some contrapuntal or fugal stuff going on in it, but there isn't very much. That wasn't Sibelius's deal. But this has a wonderful fugue, an absolutely fabulous fugue, followed by a return to the mood of the opening, a very passionate exordium in slow tempo once again. And so the Harris Third is definitely one of those pieces that you will want to know and want to hear and want to own if you are interested in sequels to the Sibelius Seventh. And it really is an American masterpiece. Another one that no one pays attention to either, but it's really, really good, is Howard Hanson's Sixth Symphony. Now, of course, everyone listens to Hanson's Romantic Symphony, his second, because it's the one that was in the film Alien. It's the one that everybody knows. It's very pretty. It has a gorgeous tune that you hear a million times. But Hanson was often regarded as sort of America's answer to Sibelius, which I think is kind of silly. Because for me, anyway, he doesn't sound too much like Sibelius, number one. And number two, other than that he's tonal. And number two, Sibelius was a much greater composer, I mean, in my view. But that's okay. Howard Hanson did some very, very good work, and his Sixth Symphony is in a single movement in multiple sections. There's like 5 or 6 of them. And one of those sections, the finale of the whole thing, the final roundup, was used by yours truly in the disc Earquake with the Helsinki Philharmonic, the world's most loud, noisy, exciting, rhythmic, and fun classical music. I have to flog this disc. It's on Ondine. Making this recording in Helsinki was one of the most fun things I ever did. I got to make my Helsinki Philharmonic debut as special guest anvilist in Jan Leif's Hekla, the volcano, where I had to be anvil player because it needs 21 percussionists. And so, gosh, it was just enormous fun. And the very first thing on the disc is the closing section of Hanson's Sixth Symphony. And to make it even more exciting, we had an aerobic dance soloist come out and jump around all over the stage in her leotard in time to the music. And let me tell you, it was quite the spectacle. So let's listen to, who was it, Leif Segerstam, yes, with the Helsinki Philharmonic playing the end of Hanson's Symphony number 6 on Ondine. Wasn't that fun? You really ought to get the Hanson Sixth. It's a good piece, very good piece. And there's a very good performance of it, good recording of it by Gerard Schwartz of the Seattle Symphony. If it's still around, it was on Naxos last. It's probably available. And finally, staying with America and the later school of American composers, one of the most famous single movement symphonies was Christopher Rouse's Symphony number 1, which is actually a big long adagio, more in the style of that other composer whose name begins with a B, who is famous for doing adagios. Oh, what the heck. In the style of Bruckner. Yes, that always happens now for some reason whenever I mention him. Anyway, this is a terrifically angry, brooding, intense, dark, 25-minute long single wedge of monolithic sound. Very much worth knowing. This recording is with David Zinman and the Baltimore Symphony. It's on Nonsuch, or it was on Nonsuch, but it's really a good piece. and it put Rouse on the map as a symphonic composer. So that was a lot of fun. And now, before we take on the UK, which is how we're going to wind this thing up, I want to talk about a little interlude, a fascinating one-movement symphony interlude. I'm thinking of the Danish composer Rued Langgaard. Now, Rued Langgaard wrote 16 symphonies, and they are in every possible style. But he was writing one-movement symphonies before Sibelius was, in the 19 teens. And the reason he was doing it, I mean, his model was not Sibelius because he hadn't done it yet, and he was the anti-Nielsen. I mean, he was a sort of spontaneous, let-it-all-hang-out, crazy, romantic nutcase with a great classicizing streak. He liked, for example, Niels Gade and some of these other guys. It's very, very odd what his stylistic parameters were because they changed constantly. But one of these symphonies was something called, let me see here, I've got to get the title because it's Danish. And it doesn't make any more sense in English, by the way, than it does in Danish. This, by the way, is the wonderful set of the complete Langgaard symphonies on Da Capo. And you ought to have it because it's really fun. They are with Thomas Dalsgaard and the Danish National Symphony Orchestra. They're Da Capo. It's just terrific stuff on Da Capo. But here is, let's see, it's called, I mean, these all have titles. A lot of them have titles. There's Mountain Pastorals and Awakening of Spring and The Flush of Youth, La Melodia, and Leaf Fall, whatever that is. And let's see, Symphony number 5, and 2 versions, one of which is just called what it is, and the other is called Summer Legend Drama. And that's also a one-movement symphony in 5 sections. But number 6, number 6, the Heaven Rending, which in Danish is Det Himmelsrivende, or something like that. And it's actually a giant theme and variations, or variations on 2 themes, or 2 versions of one theme, with individual character variations, a toccata and a fugue and a thing. But it's a one-movement unit, and it seems like the inspiration for a lot of what Langgaard did was Scriabin and those people. I mean, you have to remember, Scriabin's 4th and 5th symphonies are the Poem of Ecstasy and the Poem of Fire, Prometheus, the last one. Because he gave them titles like the Poem of Ecstasy, nobody thinks of them as symphonies. And it might be that they're not, in the sense of in the sense that they're too fixated on one thing, perhaps, to be as all-encompassing as we like to think a symphony being. I don't know. But it's worth pointing out that Scriabin did call them symphonies, and that they precede Sibelius Seventh by a couple of decade and a half, and others were influenced by those too. So in addition to the German 4-in-1 Schoenberg Chamber Symphony school of symphonic writing, there is also the Russian Scriabin-esque tone poem / symphony school. And Langgaard kind of belongs to that. So I'm going to play you a little bit of the Heaven Rending of Symphony number 6. This is from the Variation 6, which is simply called Sonata, and then there's a coda. I assume that what we're about to hear is the rending part of the heaven rending thing that's going on here. So here it is, Rend Away. Cool, isn't it? I mean, really, he's a character, this guy, a real character, and a very prolific composer. And, let me just put this away here. It has a very interesting packaging. I'm going to show this to you. It's actually very effective packaging. You get a nice sturdy box. Remember when we talked about crazy CD packaging? And then you've got the discs in these really handy folding slip cases. That slip cases, here they go. They come out like this. And then a really comprehensive booklet that sticks in a little pocket in the back. It's a beautiful way to do this. And then it all folds, it opens up when you open it up, and then it folds back down when you close it. Pretty cool, huh? It's definitely a good thing. And he's a character, and he's an original. He's an original who's outside of all of these other traditions that we've been talking about. And so it's worth acknowledging his genius and his originality as well. He was a loon. I mean, he was a sort of, isolated church organist, and he had a very strange personal life that we don't need to go into. He was definitely out there, without a doubt, and so is his music. Now, let's talk about the UK. In the UK, there are quite a few single movement symphonists who I would like to talk about. One of them, and possibly the most prolific of them all, is Havergal Brian. Now, Havergal Brian just wrote 32 symphonies, including the Gothic, the world's largest piece of anything. And after that, which was nominally it was his second, but he numbered it as first, and it's complicated. But the bottom line is, after that, he slimmed down, at least in terms of length and duration, and he started writing single movement symphonies, beginning with number 6. That's a one movement symphony. Number 7 is in 4 movements, but then you've got, after that, 8, 9, 10. From there on, most of them, if not all of them, are single movement symphonies. And they're in his own very personal, very gnarly, contrapuntal, some of them are really, he wrote like the last dozen or two after he was like 80. He lived to be in his 90s. I don't know just how good the music really is in some of these late works, but the earlier ones, for up to number 20 or so, were really pretty extraordinary. Some of them are anyway. And 8 and 9 are particularly wonderful, and they exist in fabulous performances here by Charles Groves. I think that they were also issued on Naxos, or one of them was at least, or they're getting to be issued on Naxos. And they're really, really wonderful. I mean, I think they're just marvelous. And Symphony number 11 is also on this disc with Charles Mackerras. It's only 13 minutes long. Some of these symphonies became very, very short, but they are plainly in the footsteps of Sibelius's single movement Symphony number 7. So Havergal Brian is a composer to look into. I mean, he's worth looking into anyway, but you have to be prepared to spend a lot of time and to sort of get into the gnarly and somewhat truculent and angular and not too listener-friendly idiom. It's tonal. I mean, it's not like atonal, don't run away from it, scary type thing, but it's still pretty, it's tough. He's a tough symphonist. We may talk about him more as part of that series. So another one, and I'm sticking with sort of the avant-garde here a little bit because I think it's fun to see, where that went, is Roberto Gerhard, who was a Spanish composer who wound up in England. A wonderful, wonderful composer, but he was a strict sort of, grew into a strict Schoenbergian atonalist. And his music is extremely virtuosic and fabulously scored and very, very gnarly. I think he's terrific. I really do. And his 4th symphony is subtitled New York. Is a 26-minute long single movement. A marvelous piece of music with lots of subsidiary sections and things that go on. And if you want to think if you could follow it, don't worry about it. You just listen to it. It's really captivating in a lot of parts, and I think the whole thing hangs together very well. He wrote 4 symphonies in all, but his 2nd symphony he was in the process of rewriting when he died, so it's sort of up in the air. But they are good pieces, good, solid, 20th century, challenging, advanced harmonically and formally, based on, I think, the example of Sibelius Symphony number 7, although the idiom couldn't be more different. However, one composer whose late style is somewhat avant and whose idiom couldn't be more different from Sibelius's, but whose conception is rather similar, is Michael Tippett. Now, Tippett's Fourth Symphony has only had two recordings, basically. I think there was like actually a BBC cover disc or something with it on it, but forget that. We're talking about commercial, normal recordings. There was the premiere recording with Schulte in Chicago, which I never thought was very good. And then there is this one on Chandos with Richard Hickox and the Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra, which is really, really good. And it's coupled with the Fantasia on a theme of Handel, or the Fantasia Concertante on a theme of Corelli. Now, the Fourth Symphony is very Sibelian in concept, not at all in sound, because in his late works, Tippett was dealing with almost what you might call musical archetypes, kinds of music. It was almost as if the notes didn't really matter. It was the nature of what he was doing with the sound that mattered. And the Fourth Symphony is like that because it has, for example, brass writing where he calls the theme, and he writes the score brute power, and then string themes, which he calls lyric grace. He's trying to evoke these eternal states of expression, almost independently of the notes he chooses to express them. It's very, very interesting. But the fourth is a birth symphony. Just as Sibelius's is this sort of organic opening out of its own unique form, Tippett is after the same thing. And it actually begins with a birth gesture, sort of a giant convulsion, followed by breathing sounds on a wind machine. In Schulte's performance, they used electronic breathing, which sounded really creepy and horrible. But it starts breathing, and then the music starts to open up and expand outward. The entire piece is, it's about 33 minutes long in this performance, and it does contain the four basic movements of a symphony in it. There's a slow movement, there's a scherzo and trio, and there's a finale. But between them are developmental episodes. And the whole thing is absolutely continuous and seamless in the way that it's written. It's a very challenging work, but I think in terms of the overall concept and idea for what Tippett was attempting, it's a wonderful, wonderful conceptual sequel to the Seventh of Sibelius. And I really recommend it for that reason. If you get the concept of the Sibelius Seventh, if you get its sort of intellectual framework, then that may be an entree into the very, very special world of the Tippett Fourth, which is no less personal sonically. I mean, again, Tippett had a very personal style. His late style is thorny and difficult and all over the place, but it's him, recognizably him, and I think this is a work whose time has yet to come. It may never, because we're now past sort of that whole atonal thing, and we're back to like tonality, and composers who continue to write in this kind of audience unfriendly style may be beyond hope of recovery. And so Tippett's late works, the Third Symphony, the Fourth Symphony, I don't know how much future they've got. But they deserve to have one, and they certainly deserve to have one within the context of his work as a whole, and for those who admire and respect what he did. And I think he did some tremendous stuff. I really do. So Tippett's Fourth is an interesting sequel to Sibelius' Seventh. And last but not least, not by any imagination, because I have some sample to play you, is the Fifth Symphony of William Alwyn. Now, William Alwyn was known in British music circles more as a film composer, but he was a very, very serious composer. He wrote 5 symphonies and some other gorgeous works. One of the ones that I talked about in my talk on modern harp concertos is Lyra Angelica for harp and strings, one of the most beautiful works of the 20th century. His style also evolved from a somewhat neoclassical tonal framework, but in his symphonies, he's much more abstract. It's not difficult to listen to, the music. It really isn't, in terms of its idiom. But it's intellectual and stimulating for that reason, I think. And it has, normal emotional states and thematic ideas. But he's much more interested in working with small motivic cells and sort of harmonic things and constructs that we don't have to go into. It's just interesting to listen to, and it doesn't sound like anyone else. You may miss the tunes. There are times in his music where he's doing something and you sort of wish that there was like a tune on top of what's going on, but it's very, very well written and well constructed, and he was definitely an aesthete as a composer. For example, his Fifth Symphony has a subtitle. The subtitle, wait a minute, is Hydriotaphia. Hydriotaphia are burial urns. You know, you put your ashes in it and you bury them in the urn. And it's based on a book. I'm reading the notes. I can't even figure out what they're talking about. Some guy wrote a book. It has to do with burial urns, and Alwyn read it, and he dedicated the symphony to him or his memory, or he stuck in quotations from this book on burial urns. And I mean, it's so unhelpful as a musical concept. It's a wonderful 15-minute chunk of symphonic music. And I just want to play you the opening of it. It's with David Lloyd-Jones and the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic on Naxos, coupled with Lyra Angelica. So you're going to have to get this anyway, because you have to get Lyra Angelica, right? So here is Symphony No. 5 by William Alwyn, Hydriotaphia. Ooh. I mean, really, what do you want? I mean, what are you going to call your symphony? Dieffenbachia. That's a wonderful, wonderful name for a symphony. How about diphtheria? That's a really good one. I don't know. I don't understand why composers do this to themselves. I truly don't. He's so much better off calling it Symphony No. 5. That's all he needed to do. But it's okay. It's good music. It's a wonderful performance, wonderful recording. And a worthy composer wrote a nice pile of very, very enjoyable orchestral music. And so this pile, I don't know, it's like a dozen examples or more, in every conceivable style, shows you just where composers can take a bit of inspiration. Now, I don't know how many of these guys were thinking of Sibelius when they wrote their one-movement symphonies. I have no idea, and deliberately so. I think it's much more fun for us to listen and see if there are similarities or conceptual similarities or differences. And in the case of Langgaard, we're dealing with something that's earlier, but it's still, it's a marvelous, marvelous concept and an excellent way to get yourself into different niches of the repertoire that you might not have suspected existed, some names that you probably didn't know, and a wonderful, wonderful excuse to keep on listening. So thank you so much for joining me. Take care.